Welcome to Story Tales. Please like this video and subscribe to Story Tales. I hope you enjoy the story. Let's begin. John Week sat in the cramped conference room, watching his wife's lawyer shuffle papers with the confidence of a man who had already won. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow that made even the wood-grain table look cheap. "Mr. Week," the lawyer said, not bothering to look up, "your wife has presented compelling evidence of financial impropriety." John's hand stayed folded in his lap. 43 years old, and this was what it came to. A room that smelled like stale coffee and broken dreams, watching strangers divide up the life he'd built with his bare hands. Ava sat across from him, her blonde hair pulled back in that way she did when she meant business. She wore the red dress he'd bought her for their 15th anniversary. The irony wasn't lost on him. "John always kept secrets," she said, her voice carrying that wounded tone she perfected over the years. "He had money from me, made me feel like I was begging for scraps from my own husband." John's lawyer, an overworked public defender named Mills, cleared his throat. "Mrs. Week, these allegations are—" "Mrs. Carol Week," Ava corrected. She'd already taken back her maiden name. "And they're not allegations. I have bank statements." She slid a folder across the table. John knew what was inside without looking. Carefully doctored records that made his modest business account look like he was hiding millions. Carter had helped her with those. His own cousin, who'd sat at John's dinner table every Christmas for 20 years. "This is fabricated," John said quietly. "Is it?" Ava leaned forward. "Then explain why you have 3 separate accounts I never knew about." "Because you spent everything in the joint account on your networking trips to Seattle." The words hung in the air like smoke. Everyone in the room knew what those trips were really about. Everyone except his family, who chose to believe Ava's version instead. "My client was exploring legitimate business opportunities," Ava's lawyer interjected. John almost laughed. Legitimate business opportunities. That's what they were calling it when your wife drives to another city to spend weekends with your cousin in hotel rooms you couldn't afford. "Mr. Week," the mediator said, "given the evidence presented, we're prepared to offer the following settlement." John listened as they carved up his life. The house went to Ava. The business, which he'd built from a single truck and a stack of business cards, will be liquidated to pay her emotional damages. Even the workshop behind the house, where he'd spent countless hours fixing engines and teaching neighborhood kids about tools, would be sold. "This is everything I have," John said. "Everything you earned during the marriage belongs to both parties," the mediator replied. "Oregon is a no-fault state." "No fault." John stared at the papers they wanted him to sign. 20 years of marriage, and nobody was at fault. Not Ava for emptying their accounts. Not Carter for sleeping with his cousin's wife. Not his brother Ray, who testified that John was unstable and prone to hiding things. Nobody was at fault, but somehow John was the one losing everything. He signed the papers. Outside the courthouse, Ava waited by her car. Carter leaned against the hood, wearing one of those expensive shirts John could never afford. His cousin had always been the talker in the family, the one who could sell ice to Eskimos. He'd sold Ava a story about John being controlling and secretive, and she'd bought it completely. "John," Ava called out, "we need to talk." He kept walking toward his truck, the same rusted Ford he'd been driving for 8 years. Everything else was gone now, but at least they'd let him keep the truck. "John, don't be like this," she said, hurrying to catch up. "This doesn't have to be ugly." He stopped walking and turned around. Carter had straightened up now, ready to play protector if needed. The man who destroyed John's marriage was now worried about protecting his prize. "You got what you wanted," John said. "I got what I deserved," Ava replied. "You never trusted me with anything. The business, the money, the decisions. I felt like a prisoner in my own marriage. You felt like a prisoner because you were plotting your escape." Carter stepped forward. "Hey now, that's enough. Ava doesn't need to listen to this." John looked at his cousin for the first time since the hearing started. Carter was taller than him, always had been. Better looking too, with those white teeth and that easy smile that made people want to believe whatever he was selling. 20 years, Carter," John said. 20 years you sat at my table, ate my food, borrowed my tools. Slept in my guest room when your power got cut off. That's got nothing to do with this, Carter replied, but his voice sounded less confident than usual. You're right. This is about you sleeping with my wife while I was working 16-hour days to keep the business running. Ava's face flushed red. You don't know what you're talking about. I know you were charging hotel rooms to the company credit card. I know Carter's been driving past our house every day for 6 months, but only when my truck wasn't in the driveway. John watched them exchange glances, the same look they'd probably shared in all those hotel rooms. We didn't plan this, Ava said. No, you just fell into each other's arms by accident. Right onto that king-size bed at the Marriott. Carter's jaw tightened. You want to do this here? In a parking lot. I want to do this nowhere. I want to get in my truck and drive away from both of you. Good, Ava said, because we're going to build something together. Something real. John looked at her one last time. She was still beautiful, still carried herself like she deserved better than whatever she had. That's what had attracted him to her in the first place, back when they were both 23 and thought love could conquer anything. You already built something, Ava. You built this. You and Carter and everyone else who decided I was the problem. He walked away, ignoring Carter's voice calling after him. Something about being an adult and handling this better. John climbed into his truck and drove away from the courthouse, away from the house he'd lost, away from everything he'd thought was permanent. 3 days later, he moved into a trailer on the outskirts of town. The place came furnished with a broken refrigerator and water stains on every wall. The rent was $400 a month, which was about all he could afford after paying Ava's lawyer fees. His brother Ray called once to check on him, not to apologize for testifying against him, just to make sure he hadn't done anything stupid. You need to move on, Ray said. This whole thing with Ava and Carter, it's probably for the best. For who? For everyone. You two weren't happy. Anyone could see that. John hung up without saying goodbye. Ray was probably right about them not being happy. But happiness and loyalty weren't the same thing, and his family had forgotten the difference. 14 months later, John was replacing brake pads on his truck when his phone rang. He almost didn't answer it. These days, phone calls usually meant bill collectors or lawyers with more papers to sign. Mr. Week? This is Elias Monroe. I'm an attorney in Sacramento, California. John wiped his hands on a rag and walked away from the truck. I already told you people, I don't have any money left to take. Sir, I'm not calling about debts. I'm calling about your uncle, Luther Week. John stopped walking. Uncle Luther. He hadn't thought about the man in years. Luther was his father's younger brother, the one who'd left Oregon back in the 80s and never looked back. Family stories painted him as a drifter, someone who'd never amounted to much. What about him? I'm afraid he passed away last week. Heart attack. He left very specific instructions that you be contacted immediately. I haven't talked to Luther in 15 years. That may be true, but you're listed as his primary beneficiary. Mr. Week, I need you to come to Sacramento for the reading of his will. John looked around his cramped trailer. Bills stacked on the counter. Past due notices taped to the refrigerator. He was 3 weeks behind on rent and living on peanut butter sandwiches. I can't afford to travel to California. Mr. Week, I'll arrange for your transportation. This is important. Something in the lawyer's voice made John pay attention. How important? Important enough that you should plan to stay for several days. 2 days later, John sat in another conference room, but this one was different. Real wood furniture, leather chairs, windows that looked out on actual trees instead of parking lot. Elias Monroe was a thin man with gray hair and expensive glasses who treated everyone like they mattered. The rest of the Week family was there too. His father Samuel, looking older than his 72 years. His sister Marlene, who'd driven down from Portland with her husband. Ray and his wife Janet. Both of them wearing their church clothes like this was some kind of special occasion. And there was Ava, sitting next to Carter like they belonged there. She'd probably heard about Luther's death through the family gossipy vine and decided to pay her respects. Or maybe she was just curious about what the black sheep uncle might have left behind. Thank you all for coming, Monroe said, opening a thick folder. Luther Week left very specific instructions regarding his estate. Samuel leaned forward. Elias, I know my brother never had much. We don't expect. Mr. Week, Monroe interrupted gently. Your expectations may not align with reality. The lawyer pulled out several documents and arranged them on the table with careful precision. Luther Week accumulated significant assets during his time in California. Real estate investments, business holdings, stock portfolios. Marlene exchanged glances with her husband. How significant? The estate is valued at approximately $65 million. The room went completely silent. John heard the air conditioning humming, the distant sound of traffic outside, the rustle of papers as Monroe continued organizing documents. $65 million. More money than their entire family had ever dreamed of. Samuel found his voice first. That's impossible. Luther worked construction his whole life. Initially, yes, but he invested wisely and eventually started his own development company. He was quite successful. Ava was staring at the papers like they were written in a foreign language. Carter's mouth hung open slightly, that smooth-talking confidence nowhere to be found. So how do we divide it? Ray asked. Between the siblings and their children? Monroe looked directly at John. Actually, Mr. Week, the entire estate goes to a single beneficiary. Who? Samuel demanded. John Week. John felt like someone had punched him in the stomach. Everyone in the room was staring at him now, their faces showing various degrees of shock, confusion, and anger. That's impossible, Marlene said. Luther barely knew John. They haven't spoken in years. Nevertheless, the will is quite clear. Monroe slid a document across the table to John. Mr. John Week is the sole heir to Luther Week's estate. John stared at the papers without really seeing them. The words seemed to swim on the page. Sole heir. $65 million. It felt like some kind of elaborate joke. There has to be a mistake, Samuel said, his voice rising. I'm Luther's brother. Marlene is his niece. This boy hasn't even called his uncle in 15 years. The will was updated 18 months ago, Monroe replied calmly, after Mr. John Week's divorce proceedings became public record. That got everyone's attention. John looked up from the papers and saw his family staring at him with expressions he'd never seen before. Not quite anger, not quite fear, but something in between. Carter finally found his voice. This is crazy. John's broke. He's living in a trailer. Why would Luther leave him anything? Perhaps, Monroe said, Luther felt that John had been treated unfairly by his family. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Samuel's face flushed red, and Marlene looked like she'd been slapped. Now wait just a minute, Ray said. We all did what we thought was best during John's divorce. Ava needed support. Ava needed honesty, John said quietly. It was the first time he'd spoken since Monroe announced the inheritance. Everyone turned to look at him again, and he realized they were seeing him differently now. Not as the family failure, the man who'd lost everything to his cheating wife. Now he was the man with $65 million. John, Ava said, her voice softer than it had been in years. I know things got complicated between us, but nothing. John folded the papers and stood up. You all made me an outsider. Now I own everything you wanted. He walked toward the door, ignoring the voices calling after him. In the hallway, he could hear them arguing through the closed door. Samuel demanding answers from Monroe. Marlene insisting there must be some way to contest the will. Carter's voice rising above the rest, talking about fairness and family obligations. John kept walking until he reached the parking lot, then sat in his truck for 20 minutes, trying to process what had just happened. $65 million. More money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes. Money that would let him do anything he wanted, go anywhere he chose. Money that would let him finish what his family had started. That evening, Monroe asked John to meet him at a quiet restaurant near the hotel. John had checked into the nicest place he'd ever stayed in, a suite that cost more for one night than he usually spent on food in a month. Your family seems upset, Monroe said, cutting into his steak. They'll get over it. Will they? Because I suspect this inheritance is going to change a lot of relationships. John pushed food around his plate. He wasn't very hungry. My relationships with them changed already. This just makes it official. Monroe studied him for a moment. Your uncle left you a personal letter. I was instructed to give it to you after the initial will reading. He handed John a sealed envelope with his name written in shaky handwriting. John recognized Uncle Luther's penmanship from birthday cards he'd received as a child. Should I read this now? That's up to you, but I think it might explain why he chose you as his heir. John opened the envelope and unfolded a single sheet of paper. John, if you're reading this, then I'm dead, and you're probably wondering why I left you everything. The answer is simple. We're the same, you and me. Both of us got betrayed by family who were supposed to love us. 40 years ago, your father and Marlene stole money from me. Not borrowed, stole. I had saved up enough to buy my first piece of land, and they took it. Said it was for a family emergency, but I found out later they used it to invest in some business that made them both rich. They left me with nothing, John, just like they left you with nothing. I came to California with empty pockets and a broken heart, but I survived, and eventually I thrived. I built something they could never touch, never take away. The money is yours now, on one condition. Use it to finish what I never could. Make them understand that actions have consequences. That betrayal has a price. Don't be weak like I was. Don't just run away and hope they forget what they did. Make them remember. Your uncle, Luther. John read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope. Did you know about this? He asked Monroe. I knew Luther felt betrayed by his family. He never went into details, but he mentioned it when he updated his will. You want me to get revenge. You want you to get justice. There's a difference. John looked out the restaurant window at the Sacramento skyline. Somewhere in this city, Luther had built a fortune from nothing. He'd started with empty pockets and a broken heart, just like John had. What did he mean about finishing what he couldn't? Monroe leaned back in his chair. Luther spent 40 years building wealth, but he never confronted the people who wronged him. He regretted that. Near the end, he talked about unfinished business. So he's giving you the money to do what he was too afraid to do. Maybe. Or maybe he's giving you the tools to rebuild your life in a way that proves you're stronger than the people who try to break you. John thought about his father's testimony during the divorce. The way Samuel had painted him as unstable, secretive, untrustworthy. His own father, standing in a courtroom and helping strangers destroy his son's life. They chose sides, John said. Yes, they did. And now they're going to want to unchoose. Monroe smiled. I suspect your phone is going to ring quite a bit over the next few days. As if summoned by his words, John's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Ray. We need to talk. This inheritance thing is crazy. Family should stick together. John showed the message to Monroe, who chuckled. That didn't take long. No, it didn't. John deleted the message without responding. Family should stick together. Where was that sentiment when they were all taking turns stabbing him in the back? He looked at Luther's letter one more time, focusing on the last line. Don't be weak like I was. Weakness was running away and hiding. Weakness was letting people destroy you without consequences. Weakness was forgiveness without accountability. John Weak had been weak once. That version of himself died in a conference room when he signed papers giving away everything he'd worked for. This new version, the one with $65 million and nothing left to lose, was going to be different. Luther's condition wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. It was about making sure that betrayal had a price, and that people who chose to be enemies stayed enemies. John paid for dinner and drove back to his hotel, ignoring 3 more text messages and 2 voicemail notifications. Tomorrow he would fly back to Oregon and begin the next phase of his life. Tonight, he would plan. The news broke in the local paper 3 days after John returned to Oregon. Local man inherits fortune, read the headline, along with a photo they dug up from his high school graduation. The article got most of the details wrong, but it got the important part right. John Weak, the guy living in a trailer behind Murphy's auto shop, was now worth $65 million. John was changing oil in his truck when the first car pulled up. He recognized the sound of Carter's engine before he saw the man himself. Expensive import, probably leased, the kind of car that announced you were doing well even if you weren't. Ava stepped out of the passenger side, wearing a blue dress John had never seen before. She looked nervous, fidgeting with her purse strap, and checking her reflection in the car's window. Carter walked around the car, and stood next to her, his usual confidence replaced by something that looked almost like fear. John wiped his hands on a rag and waited for them to make the first move. "John," Ava said, her voice carrying across the small yard. "We'd like to talk to you." "So talk." She looked around at the trailer, the broken fence, the pile of auto parts John had been meaning to organize. "Maybe we could go somewhere private?" "This is private enough." Carter stepped forward, flashing that salesman smile that had always worked on everyone except John. "Come on, cousin. Let's not do this out here like we're strangers." "We are strangers." The smile faltered. "That's not true. We're family. We've always been family." John pulled the oil drain pan out from under his truck and set it aside. "Family doesn't steal from family, Carter. Nobody stole anything. The divorce court. I'm not talking about the divorce." The yard fell silent, except for the sound of oil dripping from the pan. John straightened up and looked at both of them. These people who had destroyed his life and were now standing in his yard, asking for forgiveness they didn't deserve. "You've changed, John," Ava said finally. "You look different. You deserve this." "No, I earned this." "You deserve what's coming." "What's that supposed to mean?" Carter demanded. John turned his back on them and started walking toward the trailer. He heard Ava's footsteps hurrying to catch up. "John, wait. Please. I know I hurt you, but we don't have to be enemies." He stopped at the trailer door and turned around. "Yes, we do." "Why?" "Because you chose to be enemies when you thought I had nothing. You don't get to choose to be friends now that I have everything." Ava's eyes filled with tears. "I never meant for things to happen this way. You meant for exactly this to happen. You and Carter planned it for months. Hotel receipts don't lie, Ava." Carter's face flushed red. "You want to drag all that up again? It's over. Done. We're married now. Are you happy?" The question seemed to catch them off guard. Carter and Ava exchanged glances, and John saw something pass between them. Not love, not even attraction, just the recognition that they were stuck with each other now. "Of course we're happy," Ava said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Good. Then you don't need anything from me." John went inside the trailer and closed the door behind him. Through the thin walls, he could hear them arguing in the yard. Carter's voice getting louder, Ava trying to calm him down. Eventually, he heard the car door slam and the engine start up. He watched through the window as they drove away, then picked up his phone and scrolled through the missed calls. 17 messages from family members who hadn't spoken to him in over a year. The first voicemail was from his father. "John, it's Dad. We need to talk about this inheritance situation. Call me back." No apology. No acknowledgement of how Samuel had testified against his own son in court. Just a demand for John's time, like he was still the same broken man they'd all written off. The second message was from Marlene. "Johnny, I know you're upset about the divorce and everything, but family is family. We should discuss how to handle Luther's estate responsibly." Responsibly, as if John couldn't be trusted with money, just like they'd convinced the court he couldn't be trusted with his own business. He deleted all the messages without listening to the rest. That evening, his phone rang again. This time it was his father, calling instead of leaving voicemails. "John, we need to talk." "About what?" "Don't play games with me, son." "About the money." John sat down on his couch, a sagging piece of furniture that had come with the trailer. "What about it?" "Luther's will doesn't make sense. He never talked to you, never showed any interest in your life. There has to be some mistake." "No mistake, Dad. Luther knew exactly what he was doing." "What's that supposed to mean?" John looked at the letter Luther had left him, now framed and sitting on his kitchen counter. "It means he understood what loyalty looks like and what betrayal costs." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Samuel spoke again, his voice was different, smaller. "Your mother and I did our best during the divorce. We tried to stay neutral. You testified for Ava. We testified for the truth. You testified for a lie." Another pause. "John, I need your help. The farm is in trouble. The bank is talking about foreclosure." John almost smiled. There it was, the real reason for the call. Not guilt, not family loyalty. Just the same thing that had always motivated his father. Money. "How much trouble?" $200,000. Maybe less if I can negotiate with them. $200,000. Pocket change compared to what John had inherited, but still more money than Samuel had ever asked for in his life. That's a lot of money, Dad. Not for you. Not anymore. It's still a lot of money. John, I'm your father. I changed your diapers, taught you to drive, helped you start your business. And then you destroyed it. I didn't destroy anything. I told the truth in court. You told Ava's version of the truth. Samuel's voice hardened. I told them what I saw. You were secretive. You did hide money from your wife. I hid money from my wife because my wife was spending everything we had on her affair with my cousin. You don't know that for certain. John hung up. The phone rang again immediately, but he didn't answer. It rang 5 more times over the next hour, then stopped. Probably his father giving up and deciding to try a different approach. Sure enough, the next morning Ray showed up at the trailer. John's brother looked tired, older than his 45 years. Working construction had aged him, and the stress of trying to keep up with his wife's spending habits had aged him more. Dad says you hung up on him. Dad says a lot of things. Ray sat down on the trailer's front steps without being invited. Look, I know you're angry about the divorce. I get it, but this inheritance changes things. Ow! You can afford to be generous now. You can afford to forgive. John leaned against the trailer door and studied his brother. Ray had always been the mediator in the family, the one who tried to smooth over conflicts and keep everyone happy. It was a thankless job that had left him exhausted and bitter. Can I afford to forgive? Or can my family afford for me to forgive? What's the difference? The difference is whether forgiveness comes with conditions. Whether I'm supposed to forgive and forget, or forgive and write checks. Ray ran his hands through his thinning hair. The farm is going under, John. Dad's too proud to admit it, but he's broke. Without help, he'll lose everything. He already lost everything. He lost his son. You're still his son. Am I? Because when it mattered, when I needed his support, he chose Ava instead. He thought he was doing the right thing. John pushed out from the trailer door and walked to his truck. No, he didn't. He thought he was doing the easy thing. Big difference. Where are you going? To town. To start handling my affairs. Ray stood up and followed him. John, wait. Let's talk about this. We are talking about it. I told you where I stand. This isn't like you. John stopped walking and turned around. How would you know what I'm like? You haven't talked to me in over a year. Because you shut everyone out after the divorce. Because everyone chose sides, and it wasn't my side. Ray opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. They both knew John was right. When the divorce got ugly, when Ava started making accusations and Carter started backing her up, the family had chosen to believe the worst about John rather than defend him. We made mistakes, Ray said finally. Yes, you did. So what now? You just write us all off? Pretend we don't exist. John climbed into his truck and started the engine. I don't have to pretend anything. You already don't exist to me. He drove away, leaving Ray standing in the trailer park looking lost and confused. In his rearview mirror, John watched his brother pull out his phone, probably calling their father to report that John wasn't going to be reasonable about this. Good. Let them understand that the old John, the one who took abuse and tried to keep the peace, was gone. The new John had $65 million and nothing left to lose. The new John was going to finish what Luther started. John's first stop was the bank where he'd lost his business loan during the divorce. The same building where he'd sat across from a loan officer and watched his credit rating get destroyed by Ava's financial games. Now he walked in wearing the same clothes he'd worn to change his oil, carrying a cashier's check for $3 million. I'd like to speak with someone about purchasing real estate, he told the receptionist. She looked him up and down, taking in his work boots and the oil stain on his shirt. Do you have an appointment? No, but I have money. He showed her the check. Her eyes widened, and suddenly her attitude changed completely. Let me get Mr. Harrison for you right away. Harrison was the branch manager, a thin man in an expensive suit who'd probably never change his own oil in his life. He greeted John with the kind of enthusiasm reserved for very wealthy clients. Mr. Week, how can we help you today? I want to buy the Morrison property on Pine Street. Harrison's eyebrows shot up. The Morrison property was a large house on 2 acres, the kind of place that sold for close to $1 million. It had been on the market for 6 months. That's a substantial investment. May I ask what you do for a living? I inherit money. They spent 2 hours going through the paperwork. John paid cash, no financing needed, and arranged for the purchase to be completed through a shell company. The previous owners would never know who bought their house, because the Morrison property was the house where John and Ava had lived for 15 years. The house he'd lost in the divorce, the house where she now lived with Carter. When Ava found out her landlord was selling the property, she'd probably assume some developer was going to tear it down. She'd never guessed that her ex-husband had bought it just to evict her. From the bank, John drove to Murphy's auto shop, where he'd been working part-time to pay rent on the trailer. Murphy was a decent man who'd given John work when nobody else would hire him. "I'm quitting," John told him. Murphy looked up from the engine he was rebuilding. "You find something better? Something different?" "Well, I can't say I blame you. This place doesn't pay much." John pulled out an envelope and handed it to Murphy. Inside was a check for $50,000. "What's this?" "Thank you money. For giving me work when I needed it." Murphy stared at the check like it might bite him. "John, I can't take this." "Yes, you can. You helped me when nobody else would. That matters. Where did you get this kind of money?" "Like I said, I inherited it." Murphy shook his head, but didn't give the check back. "You sure about this?" "I'm sure about everything now." John's next stop was the office of Renee Hollis, a woman who ran a small accounting firm downtown. Carter had convinced her to invest in one of his sure-thing business deals 2 years ago. She'd lost her retirement savings when the deal collapsed. "Mr. Week," she said, looking surprised to see him in her office. "What can I do for you? I understand my cousin owes you money." Her expression darkened. "That's between Carter and me." "How much?" "I don't think that's any of your business." John sat down in the chair across from her desk. "It is if I'm offering to pay it back." That got her attention. "What?" "Carter stole your retirement money. I want to give it back." "Why would you do that?" "Because he's family, and his debts are my responsibility now." It wasn't true, of course. Carter's debts were nobody's responsibility but his own. But John had learned something important from Luther's letter. Sometimes the best revenge was generosity. "He took $80,000, Renee said quietly. John wrote her a check for $100,000. "The extra 20 is interest." She stared at the check with tears in her eyes. "I don't understand. Why are you doing this?" "Because someone should." Word of John's generosity spread quickly through the small town. By evening, 3 more of Carter's victims had contacted him. A retired teacher who'd lost money in a fake charity scheme. A young couple who'd been cheated on a house down payment. A contractor who'd never been paid for work on Carter's failed restaurant. John paid them all back with interest. He also drove out to the Boone farm, where Caleb Boone was getting ready to lose his family's land. Samuel had fired Caleb after 20 years of loyal service, claiming the farm couldn't afford to keep him. The truth was that Samuel wanted to give the job to Carter, who'd sweet-talked him into believing he could modernize the operation. Carter had lasted 3 months before running off to pursue other opportunities. Caleb had found work at another farm, but the pay was less and the commute was killing him. "Mr. Week," Caleb said, inviting John into his small house. "I heard about your uncle. I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you. I want to talk to you about my father's farm." Caleb's wife brought them coffee and quietly left the room. John could see the stress in both their faces, the weight of financial pressure that never seemed to lift. "What about it? I know he fired you unfairly. I know you need work." "John, I appreciate the thought, but I can't go back there. Your father and we don't see eye to eye anymore. You won't be working for my father. You'll be working for me." John explained his plan. He was going to buy Samuel's farm when the bank foreclosed on it. Caleb would run the operation as farm manager, with full authority to make decisions and a salary 3 times what Samuel had paid him. "The bank won't sell to you," Caleb said. "You're his son. The bank will sell to whoever has the money. And I'll make sure they understand that Samuel Week isn't part of the deal." That night, John sat in his trailer and made a list of everyone his family had wronged over the years. It was a longer list than he'd expected. Samuel's business practices had always been questionable, and Marlene's real estate deals often left clients feeling cheated. Each name on the list represented an opportunity. Not for revenge, exactly, but for justice. For making things right in a way his family never bothered to do. John's phone rang around 10 o'clock. It was Ava, her voice shaky and desperate. "John, we need to talk." "No, we don't. Please." Carter's acting crazy. He's talking about leaving town, about starting over somewhere else. Good for him. This isn't about the money. It's about us. About our history. John looked at the list of names on his kitchen table. What history? The history where you cheated on me? Or the history where you lied in court to steal my business? I know I hurt you, but you didn't hurt me, Ava. You destroyed me. There's a difference. So, you're going to destroy us back? I'm not going to destroy anyone. I'm just going to stop protecting you from the consequences of your own choices. He hung up and turned off the phone. Tomorrow he would start phase 2 of his plan. Tonight, he would read Luther's letter one more time and remember what it felt like to be powerless. He never wanted to feel that way again. The dominoes started falling 3 weeks later. Samuel received an audit notice from the IRS on a Tuesday morning. The letter was polite but firm. His tax returns for the past 5 years were being reviewed due to irregularities in reported income and business expenses. John knew about the audit because Caleb had carefully documented every questionable transaction during his 20 years working for Samuel. Unreported cash sales, fake business expenses, workers paid under the table to avoid payroll taxes. Nothing dramatic, just the kind of small-scale cheating that farmers sometimes did to make ends meet. The kind of cheating that became very expensive when the IRS decided to pay attention. "John, you have to help me," Samuel called to say. "They want to see records I don't have." "What kind of records?" "All of them. Every sale, every expense, every worker I've hired in 5 years. John was sitting in his new office, a converted storefront downtown where he'd set up Week Industries. The name was painted on the window in simple black letters. Nothing fancy or pretentious. "That sounds serious. It's going to ruin me. The penalties alone will cost more than the farm is worth. Maybe you should have kept better records." "I kept the records the same way every farmer keeps them. The IRS is just being unreasonable." John turned his chair to look out the window at the town where he'd grown up. "Or maybe they're just being thorough. You know something about this, don't you?" The question hung in the air between them. John could deny, pretend to be innocent, but there wasn't much point. Samuel would figure out eventually. "I know you cheated on your taxes for 20 years. I know you paid workers under the table and pocketed the money you should have spent on payroll taxes." "How do you know that?" "Because Caleb kept records of everything. Real records. The kind the IRS likes to see." Samuel's voice dropped to a whisper. "You turned me in. I corrected an oversight. The IRS should have audited you years ago. I'm your father. You were my father. Now you're just a man who needs to pay his taxes." John hung up and called his lawyer, Elias Monroe, who'd flown up from California to handle John's affairs. Monroe had connections in Oregon, other lawyers who specialized in different areas of practice. "The audit is proceeding," Monroe reported. "Your father's accountant is struggling to provide documentation for several large cash transactions." "How large?" "Large enough that the IRS is considering criminal charges in addition to civil penalties." John felt a momentary pang of something that might have been guilt. Then he remembered sitting in that conference room, watching his father testify that John was unstable and untrustworthy. "What about Marlene?" "That's more complicated. Real estate transactions leave better paper trails than farm sales. But there are irregularities. Marlene's real estate company had been playing games with property values and commissions for years. She'd convince elderly clients to sell their homes below market value, then flip them to her friends for substantial profits. Legal, technically, but unethical enough to get her license revoked if the state board decided to investigate. John had made sure they decided to investigate. "She'll lose her license," Monroe continued, "but probably won't face criminal charges. The victims can sue her in civil court, of course." "Are they going to sue?" "Several of them, yes. I may have suggested they contact a particular law firm that specializes in real estate fraud." John smiled. Monroe was good at his job. The real masterpiece was Carter. John's cousin had left a trail of financial crimes that stretched back years. Fake business licenses, forged tax documents, money laundering through shell companies. Carter thought he was clever, but he was really just lucky that nobody had bothered to look closely at his activities. Until now. John had hired a forensic accountant to track Carter's financial history. Every illegal transaction, every forged document, every penny that had been stolen or hidden. The accountant's report was now in the hands of both the IRS and the FBI. Carter was facing federal charges that could put him in prison for 10 years. "John, we need to talk," Ava called to say. Her voice was different now, all the confidence and entitlement gone. "Carter's been arrested. I heard. You did this." I corrected another oversight. Amazing how many oversights there have been in this family. "He's my husband. He's a criminal. There's a difference." John was standing in the house he'd bought back from the bank, the house where he and Ava had lived for 15 years. He'd had it completely renovated, every room redecorated, every trace of their marriage erased. "What do you want from me?" Ava asked. "Nothing. I want nothing from you. There has to be something, some way to fix this." John walked to the window and looked out at the yard where he'd taught neighborhood kids how to change spark plugs and check tire pressure. "You can't fix betrayal, Ava. You can only live with the consequences. I'm losing everything." "Good. Then you'll know how it feels." She started crying, but John felt nothing. No satisfaction, no guilt, no pity. Just the calm certainty that justice was being served. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry for everything." Sorry doesn't change anything. It has to count for something. John closed his eyes and thought about Luther's letter, about spending 40 years building wealth, but never confronting the people who'd wronged him, about dying with unfinished business. "It counts for exactly what my apologies counted for when you were taking everything I'd worked for. Nothing." He hung up and turned off his phone. Outside, a moving truck was pulling up to the house across the street. Another family starting over, building something new. John understood the impulse. Starting over was easier than facing the wreckage of what you'd built before. But sometimes Luther had taught him you had to stay and finish what you started. 6 months after Carter's arrest, John received another letter from Elias Monroe. Not a legal document this time, just a personal note asking him to return to Sacramento. "Luther left something else for you," Monroe explained when John arrived at his office. "He said to give it to you only after you'd begun your work." "What work?" Monroe smiled. "I think you know." He handed John another sealed envelope, this one thicker than the first. John's hands were steadier now as he opened it. 6 months of methodical planning and execution had given him a confidence he'd never possessed before. "John, if Elias is giving you this letter, it means you've started down the path I never had the courage to take. I hope it's bringing you the peace it never brought me. I need to tell you the full truth about what your father and Marlene did to me. It wasn't just money they stole. It was my future. I was engaged to a woman named Helen Morrison back in 1983. We were going to buy land together, start a farm, raise a family. I had saved every penny for 3 years to make the down payment. When I asked your father for advice about the purchase, he convinced me to let him invest the money instead. Said he could double it in 6 months through some business deal he was working on. The business deal was real estate speculation with Marlene. They used my money as seed capital and made a fortune. When I asked for my money back, they said the investment had failed. They showed me fake documents, crocodile tears, the whole performance. Helen left me when she found out I'd lost our future. She married someone else 6 months later. I never confronted them because I was afraid. Afraid of destroying the family. Afraid of being branded a troublemaker. Afraid of standing up for myself. That fear ate at me for 40 years, John. It poisoned every relationship I tried to build, every moment of happiness I might have found. I don't want that for you. I want you to be stronger than I was. The money isn't about revenge. It's about justice. It's about making sure that people who choose to be predators face the consequences of that choice. But here's the part one couldn't put in the first letter. When you're finished with them, you have to let it go. Don't make my mistake of carrying this anger forever. Build something good with what's left. Be better than they were. Be better than I was. That's the real condition, John. Finish this, then move on. Your uncle, Luther. John read the letter 3 times, then looked up at Monroe. Did you know about Helen Morrison? He mentioned her once. Said she was the only woman he ever loved. What happened to her? I believe she passed away about 10 years ago. Lung cancer. John folded the letter, and put it in his jacket pocket. He never got over losing her. No, I don't think he did. That's why he wanted you to handle things differently. John stood up and walked to the window. Sacramento looked the same as it had 6 months ago, but John felt completely different. The anger that had sustained him through the destruction of his family was fading, replaced by something that felt almost like emptiness. Is it finished? Monroe asked. Almost. What's left? John turned back to his lawyer. One last conversation. That evening, John drove to the cemetery outside Sacramento where Luther was buried. The headstone was simple granite with basic information. Name, dates, nothing about the life that had been lived between them. I finished it, John said to the stone. Dad's farm is gone. Marlene lost her real estate license and filed for bankruptcy. Carter's in federal prison for the next 8 years. A cool breeze moved through the cemetery, rustling the leaves on nearby trees. Ava's working at a diner in Portland now. Tips and minimum wage, just like the people she used to look down on. John sat down on the ground next to the grave. But you were right about the anger. It doesn't feel good anymore. It just feels empty. He pulled out Luther's letter and read it again by the light of his phone. I understand why you couldn't let it go. 40 years is a long time to carry hate, but I'm not going to make that mistake. The cemetery was quiet except for the distant sound of traffic. John stayed there for an hour, thinking about Helen Morrison and the life Luther never got to live. When he finally stood up to leave, he felt lighter somehow, like he'd been carrying a weight he didn't realize was there. Samuel Week died on a Tuesday morning in March, 8 months after losing his farm. John found out about it from Ray, who called with the news but didn't ask John to come to the funeral. The family had learned better than to expect anything from him by now. It was his heart, Ray said. The stress of everything, the bankruptcy, losing the farm, it just wore him down. John was sitting in his renovated house, drinking coffee and reading the morning paper. The obituary was on page 3. Local farmer dies at 73. Are you going to service? Ray asked. No, he was your father. He was a lot of things. Ray was quiet for a moment. I know you're angry, but he's gone now. Doesn't that change anything? John thought about it. Did it change anything? Samuel had spent his last months watching his life's work dissolve under the weight of his own poor choices. He'd died alone in a nursing home, abandoned by the same family members he'd chosen over his youngest son. No, John said finally. It doesn't change anything. So you're just going to let him go into the ground without saying goodbye? He went into the ground for me a long time ago. John hung up and finished his coffee. Outside his window, he could see the garden he'd planted where Ava's flower beds used to be. Tomatoes and peppers, practical plants that produced something useful. The funeral was held at the Methodist Church, where Samuel had attended services for 50 years. John didn't go, but he drove past the building on his way to other business. The parking lot was half empty. A few dozen cars, mostly belonging to people from Samuel's generation who felt obligated to pay their respects. John parked across the street and watched as people filed into the building. Ray and his wife, both looking older than their years. Marlene, wearing a black dress that had probably come from a thrift store. A handful of neighbors and fellow farmers who remembered Samuel from better times. Carter wasn't there, of course. He was still in federal prison, serving his sentence for financial fraud. Ava wasn't there either. She'd moved to Portland after losing the house and hadn't been back to town since. John sat in his truck and watched the service begin through the church's windows. He couldn't hear what was being said, but he could see the small crowd of mourners listening as someone, probably the minister, spoke about Samuel's life. What would they say about him? That he'd been a hard worker who'd built a successful farm from nothing? That he'd raised 3 children and supported his community for decades? All of that was true, but it was also true that he'd betrayed his own son when it mattered most. That he'd chosen sides in a battle that should never have involved him. The service lasted about an hour. John watched as people filed out of the church and gathered in small groups, sharing memories and offering condolences to Ray and Marlene. Nobody looked across the street to see if John was there. They'd probably forgotten he existed. That was fine with him. As the crowd began to disperse, John started his truck and drove away. He had other business to attend to, other plans to finalize. 3 days later, He received a call from Ray. "Dad left a letter for you," Ray said. "Found it in his desk at the nursing home." "I don't want it." "John, please." "It's the last thing he wrote before he died." "Then it's probably an apology I don't need. Will you at least read it?" "For me." John considered hanging up, but something in Ray's voice stopped him. His brother sounded exhausted, defeated, like he'd finally understood that the family he'd tried so hard to hold together had been broken beyond repair. "Leave it on my doorstep. I'll decide whether to read it or not." That evening, John found an envelope with his name on it sitting by his front door. Samuel's handwriting was shakier than Luther's had been, the letters cramped and uncertain. John took the letter inside and set it on his kitchen counter. He made dinner, watched the news, did the dishes. The letter sat there like an accusation, demanding attention he wasn't sure he wanted to give. Finally, around 10 o'clock, he opened it. "Son, I know you won't come to my funeral, and I understand why. I failed you when you needed me most, and there's no excuse for that. I thought I was protecting the family by staying neutral during your divorce. I thought I was doing the right thing by telling the truth as I saw it. I was wrong. I should have stood by you no matter what. That's what fathers do for their sons. I know you've made your choices about what happens to this family. I know I'm partly responsible for those choices. I just want you to know that I was proud of you. Always. Even when I failed to show it. Your father, Samuel." John read the letter twice, then set it aside. Too little, too late. The words Samuel should have said years ago, when they might have mattered. But as he sat there in his quiet house, John realized something important. The letter wasn't for him. It was for Samuel, a final attempt to find peace before dying. John understood the impulse. He'd been looking for peace himself for the past year. Maybe it was time to stop looking and start building it instead. Scene 3, the ending. 1 year after Samuel's death, John stood in front of the town library addressing a small crowd that had gathered for the dedication ceremony. "The Luther Week Memorial Scholarship Fund," John announced, "will provide full college funding for students from families affected by divorce, bankruptcy, or other financial hardships." The crowd applauded politely. Most of them had no idea who Luther Week was, but they appreciated the gesture. Free money for college was always popular. John had endowed the scholarship with $20 million, enough to help hundreds of students over the coming decades. The application process was designed to identify kids who'd been abandoned or betrayed by the adults in their lives. Kids who understood what it meant to lose everything through no fault of their own. After the ceremony, a local reporter approached John with questions about his motivations. "Why did you choose to focus on families affected by financial hardship?" she asked. John thought about Luther's letter, about Helen Morrison and the life that might have been, about his own experience sitting in that conference room, watching everything he'd built get divided up by strangers. "Everyone deserves a second chance," he said finally. "Some people just need help finding it." "Is this about your own experience with divorce?" "It's about making sure that when life knocks someone down, they have the tools to get back up." The reporter scribbled notes, probably looking for a more dramatic story than John was willing to provide. "Some people in town say you've been settling scores with your family. Is the scholarship fund connected to that?" John looked around the library at the small crowd of parents and teenagers who were learning about scholarship opportunities. None of them cared about his family drama. They just wanted help paying for their kids' education. "My family made their choices," John said. "This is about other people's families. People who deserve better than what they got." The reporter asked a few more questions, but John could see she was losing interest. Rich man gives money to charity wasn't much of a story in a town where nothing ever happened. That was fine with him. John had had enough of being the center of attention. After the crowd dispersed, he walked to his truck and found someone waiting for him. Ava stood by the driver's side door, wearing jeans and a t-shirt that had seen better days. She looked tired, older, like the past 2 years had aged her more than the previous 20. "Hello, John." "Ava, I heard about the scholarship fund. It's a good thing you're doing. It's what the money is for." She nodded, looking around the parking lot like she was searching for the right words. "I wanted to apologize. For everything. For the way things ended between us." John studied her face. The makeup was simpler now, applied with less skill. Her hands showed the wear of someone who worked for tips and couldn't afford regular manicures. You already apologized. I know, but I want to do it again, without asking for anything in return. John believed her. She wasn't here looking for money or forgiveness or help with her problems. She was here because guilt was a heavy burden to carry, and she needed to try one more time to set it down. Apology noted, he said. That's it. That's it. Ava looked disappointed, but not surprised. Are you happy now? With how everything turned out? John considered the question. Was he happy? He had more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes. He lived in a beautiful house filled with things he actually wanted. He could travel anywhere, buy anything, do whatever struck his fancy. But happiness wasn't the right word for what he felt. Satisfied, maybe. Complete. Like he'd finished something that needed finishing. I'm at peace, he said finally. I'm glad. You deserve peace. She turned to walk away, then stopped and looked back at him. For what it's worth, Carter regrets everything too. Prison has given him a lot of time to think about his choices. Good for him. He wants to write you a letter when he gets out, to apologize properly. John shook his head. Tell him not to bother. I won't read it. Ava smiled sadly. I figured you'd say that, but I had to ask. She walked away across the parking lot, toward an old Honda that had definitely seen better days. John watched her drive away, then got into his truck and headed home. That evening, he sat on his back porch and called Elias Monroe in California. The scholarship fund is operational, John reported. First recipients will be selected next month. Luther would be pleased. I think so too. John looked out at his yard, at the garden he'd planted and the workshop he'd built behind the house. Everything was exactly the way he wanted it, designed for his needs and nobody else's. Elias, I want to ask you something. Of course. Do you think I did the right thing? With my family. Monroe was quiet for a moment. You gave them what they gave you. Justice, not mercy. That's not what I asked. What did you ask? John thought about Samuel's letter, about Ray's voice when he'd called with news of their father's death, about Ava standing in the parking lot, trying to apologize for choices that couldn't be undone. I asked if I did the right thing. That's a question only you can answer, John. But I will say this. You kept your uncle's condition. You finished what he couldn't. And you're using the money to help people who deserve help. But nothing. You did what you set out to do. Whether it was right or wrong is between you and your conscience. After hanging up, John sat on his porch until the sun went down. The town was quiet, peaceful. Most people were inside having dinner with their families, watching television, helping kids with homework.